Dear viewers, you're about to experience a riveting story that demonstrates how preparation meets opportunity when others underestimate you completely. This narrative will teach you about protecting yourself through financial independence, the power of staying 10 steps ahead of those who'd harm you, and why silence often provides better strategy than confrontation. You'll learn why respect matters in every relationship, how betrayal often reveals people's true character when they think you're powerless, and why building your empire secretly gives you advantages that public success never could. Through Rebecca's journey, you'll see that dignity during humiliation positions you for the ultimate comeback. Drop your thoughts in the comments about which lessons you'll carry forward and what actions you'd take differently if you were facing this betrayal. Hit subscribe to join our community where every story entertains, educates, and empowers you with wisdom about justice, resilience, and personal power that transforms lives. The ultrasound photo of their daughter was still in Rebecca's purse when David told her to get out. His voice flat and final as movers he'd hired carried furniture from their mansion into a storage unit she didn't know he'd rented. Behind him, a woman half Rebecca's age examined paint swatches for walls she had no right to touch, while David's mother watched from the kitchen with satisfaction, brightening her face despite the destruction of her son's family unfolding before her. Rebecca's hands trembled as she clutched the railing, morning sickness mixing with heartbreak, but neither David nor his mistress nor his venomous mother noticed her smile. Small, knowing, and loaded with information that would detonate their lives in approximately 3 minutes. They saw a pregnant woman being discarded, powerless and pathetic, unaware she was the secret trillionaire who just acquired titanium real estate holdings through a shell corporation her financial advisor had orchestrated flawlessly. Every property David managed now answered to Rebecca's authority, including this mansion they believed belonged to them through his employment. The corporate takeover had finalized Wednesday, while David planned this Thursday ambush, giving Rebecca exactly the ammunition she needed for the war she hadn't wanted but would absolutely win. But when David's mother approached with hatred in her eyes and gathered the saliva that would strike Rebecca's face, would that single act of disrespect trigger the total annihilation Rebecca had been strategic enough to avoid? And once David learned his pregnant wife was actually his employer, his landlord, and his executioner, would bankruptcy and homelessness teach him what love should have? Rebecca's fingers traced the glossy surface of the ultrasound image through the leather of her handbag, the black and white proof of their daughter's existence, offering cold comfort against the chaos erupting around her. The mansion's foyer had transformed into a war zone, orchestrated by the man who'd promised to love her in sickness and health, though apparently pregnancy didn't qualify as either in David's revised definition of marriage vows. Movers in blue uniforms navigated the curved staircase she'd descended every morning for 7 years, their arms laden with boxes marked storage in David's aggressive handwriting, but their eyes avoided hers with the practiced discomfort of people paid to participate in cruelty. The master bedroom needs to be completely cleared by 3 o'clock, David instructed the lead mover, checking his Rolex with the efficiency of a man executing a business transaction rather than destroying his family. His charcoal suit was immaculate, despite the moral filth he'd been rolling in for the past 6 months. The same 6 months Rebecca had spent growing their child while he'd been growing attached to Amber, his 24-year-old assistant whose ambition apparently extended beyond spreadsheets and into stealing marriages. My fiancée will be moving her belongings in this evening, and I want everything perfect. Fiancée. The word landed like a physical blow, though Rebecca absorbed it with the practice she'd developed since discovering David's affair 3 weeks earlier. She'd found the texts on his iPad while looking for a recipe, the intimate messages revealing a relationship that had progressed far beyond professional boundaries into territory that included weekend getaways and discussions about their future, a future that explicitly excluded the wife currently carrying his child. But Rebecca hadn't confronted him immediately, a decision her mother would have called cowardly, but her financial advisor had called strategic. Amber emerged from the living room holding fabric samples against the afternoon light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that Rebecca had personally selected during the mansion's renovation 5 years prior. "David, I'm thinking we should go with the champagne silk for the curtains," she announced, her voice carrying the casual entitlement of someone who'd already claimed victory without understanding the war hadn't actually started yet. "It'll match the new furniture being delivered next week, and honestly, the current decor is so dated." Dated. Rebecca almost laughed at the accusation, considering she'd completed her interior design certification specifically to create the elegant aesthetic Amber was now dismissing with the certainty of youth that mistakes confidence for taste. But the laugh died in her throat as David's mother, Patricia, materialized from the kitchen where she'd apparently been preparing her entrance like an actress awaiting her cue. "Finally," Patricia declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmur of moving men and the rustle of fabric samples. "My son is correcting the mistake he made 7 years ago when he married you." She approached Rebecca with deliberate steps, her designer heels clicking against marble floors that had cost more than most people's cars, though the mansion's true owner was about to surprise everyone. "You trapped him with neediness and manipulation, but David has finally found a woman who actually deserves him." Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to protect her stomach, the gesture maternal and defensive simultaneously. But she maintained eye contact with the woman who'd made every holiday meal an endurance test and every family gathering an opportunity for criticism. Patricia had never approved of Rebecca's middle-class background, her public school education, her lack of family wealth, all the crimes of being self-made rather than born into privilege. The irony that Patricia herself had married into money rather than earned it was apparently lost on a woman whose selective memory edited out inconvenient truths. "Mrs. Harrison," Rebecca began, her voice steady despite the nausea rolling through her in waves that had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with witnessing the casual destruction of everything she'd built. "I think you should know—" "I don't want to know anything from you except that you're leaving," Patricia interrupted, stepping closer until Rebecca could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the mint tea she constantly consumed to maintain her figure. "My granddaughter deserves better than a mother who couldn't keep her husband satisfied." She paused, letting the words sink in with the cruelty of someone who'd perfected verbal warfare over decades of country club politics and charity board battles. "Actually, she deserves better than you entirely." The mansion seemed to hold its breath as Patricia gathered saliva in her mouth, her intention clear in the hatred brightening her eyes. But Rebecca didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her smile growing wider as she recognized the gift Patricia was about to give her, the perfect justification for everything that would happen next. Behind her, David's phone began ringing with the specific tone he'd assigned to his office. The sound cutting through tension like a knife through silk curtains Amber would never actually hang. The spit hit Rebecca's cheek with the temperature of Patricia's soul, cold, calculated, and completely devoid of the humanity that separated civilized people from animals operating on base instinct. The substance slid down Rebecca's face in slow motion, each millimeter of its descent witnessed by the movers who'd frozen mid-step, by Amber whose fabric samples had fallen from suddenly nerveless fingers, and by David whose expression shifted from satisfaction to something resembling concern but not quite reaching remorse. The foyer transformed into a tableau of suspended animation, everyone waiting to see how the discarded wife would respond to this ultimate humiliation. but Rebecca simply reached into her handbag with movements so calm they seemed choreographed. "Thank you, Patricia," Rebecca said softly, withdrawing not tissues to clean her face, but her phone to document the assault, with a photograph that captured Patricia's triumphant expression perfectly. "I needed that for the restraining order, though honestly, I needed it more for what comes next." She turned to David, whose phone continued its insistent ringing, the sound now accompanied by 3 text message alerts that lit up his screen with increasing urgency. "You should probably answer that. Your boss is trying to reach you, though I suppose I should clarify the hierarchy now." David's hand moved toward his phone with the automatic response of a man who'd built his career on being available to Titanium Real Estate Holdings executives 24 hours daily, but he paused mid-reach as Rebecca's words penetrated the fog of his certainty. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone who'd started to sense the ground shifting beneath expensive Italian leather shoes. "My boss is Gerald Chen, and he's in Singapore this week closing the Henderson Tower deal." "Gerald was in Singapore," Rebecca corrected, pulling a second item from her handbag, a leather folder embossed with the Titanium Real Estate Holdings logo that David had praised during countless dinner conversations about company branding. He was finalizing the Henderson Tower acquisition as his final act before retirement, which he announced to the board Wednesday morning at 9:47 a.m., the same board meeting where they approved the company's sale to Apex Holdings International. She opened the folder with movements that seemed casual but were precisely calculated to draw every eye in the foyer to documents that would redraw the landscape of everyone's future. "Apex Holdings is a shell corporation I established 6 months ago through my financial advisor, though I believe the timeline is particularly relevant given other events that began 6 months ago." Amber gasped audibly, her youth betraying her with reactions she hadn't yet learned to suppress, but Patricia's face hardened into the expression of someone who'd navigated enough social warfare to recognize a tactical nuke when she saw one. David, however, reached for the folder with hands that had started trembling in a way Rebecca had never witnessed during their 7-year marriage. Not during his presentations to executives, not during his negotiations with difficult clients, not even during their wedding when he'd promised forever with confidence that had seemed unshakable. "That's impossible," David breathed, his eyes scanning documents that included the acquisition agreement, the board resolution, the corporate structure chart showing Apex Holdings' controlling interest, and most devastatingly, the organizational hierarchy placing Rebecca Sterling, she'd used her maiden name for the purchase, at the apex of a pyramid that included David's position 3 levels down. "You don't have this kind of money. Your trust fund from your grandmother was only $5 million, and you spent most of that on your boutique consulting firm that barely breaks even." "My consulting firm that barely breaks even," Rebecca repeated, her smile widening as she watched comprehension dawn across David's face, like sunrise over a landscape about to be destroyed by wildfire. "Generated enough revenue to attract venture capital interest 3 years ago. I sold 40% equity for $200 million, then used those proceeds to invest in cryptocurrency before the 2024 boom, then diversified into AI startups that went public last year." She paused, letting the numbers sink in while David's phone continued its increasingly frantic ringing. "My current net worth is approximately $4.2 billion, though it fluctuates daily depending on market conditions. The Titanium Real Estate Holdings acquisition cost me $1.7 billion, which I considered expensive but worth it for the strategic positioning." The mansion's air conditioning hummed in the silence that followed, its mechanical efficiency contrasting sharply with the human systems failing throughout the foyer as 3 people recalculated everything they'd assumed about power, money, and the pregnant woman they'd been discarding like outdated furniture. Amber backed toward the door with instincts that recognized danger, even when her 24-year-old brain couldn't fully process the implications. But Patricia stepped forward instead of retreating, her decades of social combat apparently convincing her that offense still offered better odds than defense. "You're lying," Patricia declared, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested, the tone of someone who'd started to realize their opponent had been playing chess while they'd been playing checkers. "If you actually owned titanium real estate, you would have said something before now. You would have stopped this eviction, stopped David from revealing exactly who he is when he thinks I'm powerless," Rebecca interrupted, her voice maintaining its steady calm despite the rage that had been building for 3 weeks beneath a surface of strategic patience. "Why would I stop him from showing me the truth? I needed to know whether the man I married was worth saving or whether the affair was just a symptom of a character flaw that required more permanent solutions." She turned back to David, whose phone had finally stopped ringing, only to immediately begin again. "That's probably Gerald trying to warn you about the new ownership before the official announcement Monday, though I'm afraid you're receiving the information slightly ahead of schedule." David's finger moved to answer the call with the mechanical response of someone whose brain had blue-screened, but Rebecca's hand shot out with surprising speed for a woman 6 months pregnant, her fingers closing around his wrist with pressure that was firm without being aggressive. "Don't answer it yet," she instructed, her tone carrying the authority of someone who'd just revealed themselves as his employer rather than his victim. "I want you to fully understand your situation before Gerald explains the company-wide implications. You see, Titanium Real Estate Holdings owns this mansion, purchased it as part of the executive housing portfolio 3 years ago, and leased it to you at below-market rates as part of your compensation package, which means the house you're evicting me from doesn't belong to you at all. It belongs to me." The comprehension that flooded David's face resembled drowning in slow motion, each realization another lungful of water, pulling him deeper into consequences he'd orchestrated without understanding the stage he'd been performing on. His hand released the phone entirely, the device clattering against marble with a sound that punctuated the destruction of his carefully constructed life, but no one moved to retrieve it as the ringing finally ceased and the mansion settled into a silence so complete that Rebecca could hear Amber's breathing accelerate into something approaching hyperventilation. Patricia's complexion had shifted from its usual carefully maintained tan to a pallor that suggested her cardiovascular system was reconsidering its commitment to keeping her conscious, but the older woman remained standing through sheer force of will that Rebecca might have admired under different circumstances. "The mansion isn't the extent of it, though," Rebecca continued, her voice maintaining its devastating calm as she withdrew additional documents from the leather folder that had become Pandora's box for everyone except its owner. "Titanium Real Estate Holdings employs 4,200 employees across 6 states, manages property portfolios worth approximately $12 billion, and maintains operational headquarters in this city where you've worked for 15 years building what you called your legacy." She handed David a specific page from the stack, her fingers steady while his shook with tremors that would have concerned her yesterday, but today simply provided evidence of karma's precision. "This is the organizational restructuring plan I approved Tuesday afternoon. It eliminates 800 positions deemed redundant following the acquisition, including your role as Regional Director of Luxury Properties." David's eyes moved across the document with the comprehension of someone reading their own obituary, each line another death of assumptions he'd built his identity around, but Rebecca wasn't finished with the autopsy of his future. Behind him, Amber had located her purse and was edging toward the exit with the survival instinct of someone young enough to recognize sinking ships before they disappeared beneath waves. though she froze when Rebecca's gaze shifted in her direction with the precision of a predator who'd been tracking multiple targets simultaneously. "Amber Chen," Rebecca said, using the surname that connected David's mistress to his now former boss in ways that added another layer to the betrayal David had apparently been too arrogant or too stupid to consider problematic. "Gerald's niece, hired as David's assistant 8 months ago as a favor to family, though I'm sure your uncle would be fascinated to learn how you've been spending your professional development time." She produced her phone, which had been recording since Patricia's assault, capturing not just the spit but the entire conversation that followed, with audio clarity that would play beautifully in the wrongful termination lawsuit Rebecca's attorneys were prepared to file on Amber's behalf if necessary. "Your employment is also terminated effective immediately, though unlike David, you're receiving severance because you're young enough that I'm classifying this as a learning experience rather than a character judgment." Amber's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, her face cycling through expressions that ranged from shock to fear to something resembling relief that she'd be escaping with anything at all. But Patricia apparently decided that silence was no longer serving her interests. "You vindictive bitch," the older woman hissed, her cultured accent slipping to reveal the working-class background she'd spent 40 years disguising through elocution lessons and careful vowel placement. "You orchestrated all of this, the acquisition, the timing, everything, just to destroy my son because your inadequacies drove him to find happiness elsewhere." Rebecca turned to face Patricia with movements so controlled they seemed choreographed, her hand still protecting her stomach where their granddaughter continued growing regardless of the chaos erupting around her anticipated arrival. "I orchestrated nothing except protecting myself and my daughter from people who viewed us as disposable," she corrected, her voice carrying steel beneath silk that Patricia was finally recognizing as dangerous. "David chose to have an affair. David chose to plan this eviction. David chose to bring his mistress into our home while I carry his child. And you chose to assault a pregnant woman because your son's mistake somehow became my fault in the delusional mathematics of your prejudice." Patricia's hand rose again, the gesture suggesting she was considering repeating her earlier assault despite the documented consequences, but David finally found his voice beneath the rubble of his collapsed future. "Rebecca, please," he began, the word emerging with a desperation she'd never heard from a man who'd spent their entire marriage operating from positions of assumed superiority. "We can fix this. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we have a daughter coming. We can go to counseling, work through this, and I'll end things with Amber immediately. You don't have to destroy everything we've built together." "Everything we've built together?" Rebecca repeated, her laugh emerging sharp enough to cut through the pleading that would have worked on her yesterday, but today simply sounded like manipulation wrapped in panic. "David, you built nothing. You managed properties for a company that someone else created, lived in a mansion that someone else owned, and benefited from a wife's emotional labor while planning to replace her with a younger model the moment pregnancy made her less convenient." She collected her documents with movements that suggested the conversation had reached its conclusion, regardless of how many more words anyone wanted to contribute. "The only thing we built together was the illusion that you were more than your job title and your mother's son, but I'm grateful for the clarity that today provided." David's phone began ringing again, the sound now ominous rather than merely insistent, but Rebecca gestured for him to answer it with permission that emphasized the power dynamic that had inverted so completely in the past 15 minutes. "Go ahead," she encouraged, her smile returning with edges sharp enough to draw blood. "Gerald's probably calling to inform you that security will be escorting you from headquarters Monday morning, that your company credit cards have been deactivated, and that the lease on your BMW is being terminated since it was part of your executive compensation package." She paused, watching realization continue its devastation across David's features. "Oh, and the membership to Metropolitan Country Club, where you've been networking, also company-sponsored, also terminated. I'm afraid your lifestyle was far more dependent on titanium real estate holdings than you realized, which means it was dependent on me." 3 months later, Rebecca stood in the mansion's nursery watching sunrise paint the walls. She'd repainted in soft lavender after David's departure, had restored peace to rooms that had forgotten the meaning of sanctuary. Her daughter, Emma Rose Sterling, named for Rebecca's grandmother who'd started the trust fund that began everything, slept in the designer crib that had arrived yesterday, her tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone blissfully unaware that her existence had triggered a revolution in multiple lives. The ultrasound photo that had been in Rebecca's purse during the eviction now hung framed above the changing table, a reminder that the best revenge wasn't actually revenge at all, but rather the life you built after removing people who'd mistaken your kindness for weakness. Her phone buzzed with the morning's first message, a text from her attorney containing the final settlement documents from David's bankruptcy proceedings that had concluded Tuesday, with decisions that would follow him for the next decade. The mansion, officially owned by Titanium Real Estate Holdings and therefore by Rebecca, had been retained as her primary residence with no contestation, since David had never actually owned any part of it despite living there for years. His retirement accounts, already depleted from legal fees fighting a battle he'd lost before it started, had been divided according to prenuptial agreements he'd insisted on 7 years ago, when he'd assumed he'd always be the higher earner. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca that the document protecting his assets had actually protected hers, though her billions had never been in question. Patricia had been served with restraining orders that prevented her from contacting Rebecca or approaching within 500 feet of Emma, the assault documented by photographs and video evidence that made the judge's decision immediate and non-negotiable. The older woman had attempted to argue grandparents' rights during the hearing, but her attorney had quietly withdrawn that motion after reviewing footage of her spitting on a pregnant woman while calling her inadequate. Rebecca had heard through mutual acquaintances that Patricia had been asked to resign from 3 charity boards following the publicity, her social standing destroyed by behavior that proved money couldn't actually purchase class. Amber had taken the severance Rebecca offered and relocated to Portland, her social media accounts documenting a lifestyle considerably more modest than the luxury she'd briefly tasted while destroying someone else's marriage. Rebecca felt no satisfaction from the younger woman's reduced circumstances, though she felt no sympathy either. Amber had been old enough to know that actions carried consequences, and sleeping with married men generally didn't end with mansion living and country club memberships, regardless of how convincing the promises sounded during the affair. But David's fate provided the most comprehensive lesson in what happened when arrogance met consequences without the buffer of unearned privilege. The bankruptcy had been inevitable once Rebecca terminated his employment, revoked his company housing, and made it clear through legal channels that she would contest any attempt to claim spousal support, given his documented affair and planned abandonment of his pregnant wife. His LinkedIn profile, Rebecca checked it occasionally with the detachment of a scientist studying a failed experiment, showed a position at a mid-tier property management firm in a different city, his salary approximately 1/5 of what he'd earned at Titanium Real Estate Holdings. The BMW had been repossessed, the country club membership was a memory, and the professional network he'd spent 15 years building had evaporated when people realized he'd been fired by his wife after planning to evict her while pregnant. Emma stirred in her crib, her small face scrunching with the pre-cry expression Rebecca had learned to recognize during 3 months of solo parenting that had proven easier than 7 years of marriage to a man who'd viewed family as supporting cast, to his leading role. Rebecca lifted her daughter with practiced ease, settling into the nursing chair, positioned to catch morning light, and considered the lessons that would have made better YouTube comments than the lived experience of learning them through Betrayal. She'd learned that financial independence wasn't optional but essential, that people revealed their character when they thought you were powerless, and that patience often proved more powerful than immediate confrontation. She'd discovered that building your empire in silence protected you from those who'd sabotage public success. That respect should never be conditional on your usefulness, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply removing yourself from people who didn't deserve access to your life. But most importantly, she'd learned that dignity during humiliation positioned you for comebacks that transformed victims into victors. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her financial advisor reporting that Titanium Real Estate Holdings had exceeded quarterly projections by 18% under her ownership, the company thriving without the redundant positions and inflated egos that had been weighing it down. Rebecca smiled at the news, though her attention remained primarily on Emma, whose existence reminded her that the future mattered more than the past, regardless of how satisfying justice felt in the present. David would recover eventually. Men like him usually did, through some combination of charm, networking, and selective amnesia about their role in their own destruction. Patricia would find new charity boards once scandal's shelf life expired and society's memory reset to accommodate someone with her connections and checkbook. Amber would probably marry someone age-appropriate and tell edited versions of her 20s that omitted the parts where she'd been the other woman. But Rebecca had Emma, had her billions, had the mansion and the company and the future she'd built by being underestimated by people who'd confused silence for stupidity. She'd been the secret trillionaire who'd acquired the real estate empire her husband worked for, who'd been kicked out of their mansion by a man moving his mistress in, who'd been spat on by his mother, and what she'd done with that humiliation had left him bankrupted and homeless, not through revenge, but through the natural consequences of his choices, meeting her preparation. The sunrise completed its journey across the nursery walls, painting everything in shades of gold that matched Emma's downy hair, and Rebecca allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the eviction that had actually been liberation. Sometimes the worst thing that happened to you turned out to be the best thing that could have happened, assuming you were strong enough to survive it and strategic enough to leverage it. She'd been both, and Emma would grow up watching a mother who'd taught everyone the most important lesson of all: never underestimate someone just because they loved you enough to be kind. Kindness wasn't weakness. It was a choice that could be revoked when respect disappeared, and its absence was far more devastating than its presence had ever been gentle. The story ended not with revenge, but with restoration, not with destruction, but with reconstruction, and not with hatred, but with the peaceful indifference that came from removing people who'd proven they didn't deserve the privilege of your emotional investment. David had wanted his mistress in the mansion, and he'd gotten exactly what he asked for, just not in the building he'd assumed was his to give. Justice, Rebecca had learned, didn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like a mother feeding her daughter in a mansion she actually owned, running a company she'd purchased with money she'd earned, living a life she'd built without seeking permission from anyone who'd confused her love for dependency. And if that left some people bankrupted and homeless, well, she'd offered David counseling, offered him chances to choose differently, offered him the opportunity to be the man he'd promised to be 7 years ago at their wedding. He'd chosen Amber and arrogance instead, and consequences rarely consulted the guilty about their preferences for justice's appearance. Emma finished nursing and rewarded Rebecca with a milk-drunk smile that made every moment of the past 3 months worthwhile, every strategic decision validated, every careful plan justified. This was what mattered. Not David's bankruptcy, not Patricia's social exile, not Amber's relocated modesty, but the life Rebecca had protected by being smart enough to build power before she needed to use it. The nursery door opened, and Rebecca's mother entered with coffee and the morning newspaper, her expression carrying satisfaction that came from watching her daughter survive what should have destroyed her. The Metro section has an interesting article about Titanium Real Estate Holdings acquisition, she mentioned casually, setting the coffee within Rebecca's reach while keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing Emma. Apparently, the business community is very impressed with the new owner's strategic vision, though they seem surprised the owner is a woman. They're always surprised when women turn out to be competent, Rebecca observed, accepting the coffee with her free hand while Emma dozed against her shoulder. But surprise is better than being underestimated. I built everything while everyone assumed I was just David's wife, and by the time they realized I was more, it was too late for anyone to interfere. Her mother settled into the second chair Rebecca had positioned for. Moments like these, her presence offering the support Rebecca had lacked from Patricia, but had never actually needed once she'd stopped seeking approval from people who'd decided she was unworthy before knowing her. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly, referencing the man who'd died when Rebecca was 12, but had taught her that power meant options, and options meant freedom. He always said the best victories were the ones your enemies didn't see coming until after they'd already lost. Rebecca smiled, remembering those lessons from a childhood that had prepared her for betrayal without her realizing that's what the preparation was for, and raised her coffee in a silent toast to the father who'd given her the foundation and the grandmother who'd given her the start and the determination she'd given herself to build everything else. Emma slept through the gesture, peaceful and protected in ways she'd never know to appreciate until she was old, enough to hear the story of how her mother had turned an eviction into an empire. Outside the nursery windows, the city was waking to another day, where David would drive a used car to a job he'd taken out of necessity, where Patricia would avoid country clubs that had once welcomed her membership, where Amber would probably be fine because youth forgave mistakes that age turned permanent. But inside the mansion that actually belonged to the woman who'd been thrown out of it, justice looked like sunrise and coffee and a sleeping daughter who'd never question whether her mother was powerful enough to protect her, because Rebecca had proven she was exactly that powerful, and more importantly, she'd proven it to the only person whose opinion actually mattered, herself.